On the morning of July 27th, 2025, a discreet private jet landed on Scottish soil. On board was the President of the European Commission. Within hours, inside the ornate rooms of Donald Trump's Turnberry Golf Resort, Ursula von der Leyen would put her signature on an agreement many critics would later describe as the most degrading deal Europe had accepted in generations. France's Prime Minister labeled it outright surrender. Germany's Chancellor warned it would weaken the country's financial position. Across Europe, public trust in the United States plunged from 47% approval to just 29% in half a year. Even Washington acknowledged the scale of the moment. The U.S. Trade Representative openly stated that the agreement effectively closed the chapter on the Bretton Woods system that had shaped global trade since 1944. But almost no one focused on what truly mattered. This was not simply a trade agreement. It was the visible endpoint of an economic cycle that had been unfolding for nearly 80 years and had just completed its final turn. Once you recognize that cycle, Europe's outcome becomes almost inevitable. You begin to see why resistance was never realistic, why the next decade of global economics is already taking shape, and why the same strategy is now being applied to other major economies around the world. What happened at Turnberry was not an accident. It was not even a negotiation in the traditional sense. It was the final execution of a framework that began the moment Europe chose prosperity built on American protection, without developing the power to defend that prosperity independently. To understand it, you need to see the pattern. And once you do, global trade will never look the same again. The story doesn't begin in 2025. It begins in 1944. Europe was in ruins, entire cities flattened, industrial networks shattered, tens of millions dead, economies collapsing under the weight of war and facing the growing threat of communist expansion. Meanwhile, the United States stood alone as an intact industrial giant. Nearly half of global GDP flowed through its economy. Its factories were running non-stop. Its infrastructure was untouched. Its currency was backed by the majority of the world's gold. In July of that year, delegates from 44 nations gathered in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Officially, the goal was to prevent another Great Depression and avoid another global war. Unofficially, something far more consequential was being designed. The United States was building a new world order, one that placed itself at the center. But this was not an empire in the traditional sense. It was something entirely new, a voluntary economic system. Countries would join not because they were conquered, but because participation made them richer and safer than standing alone. Under Bretton Woods, the US dollar became the global reserve currency, tied to gold at $35 an ounce. Other currencies were anchored to the dollar. New institutions, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, were created to stabilize economies and fund reconstruction. The United States agreed to accept permanent trade deficits. It allowed other countries to sell more into the American market than America sold back. These were deliberate, uneven concessions. U.S. policymakers believed that expanding global trade would ultimately benefit American industry and workers, even if it meant short-term imbalance. This was the first phase of the cycle, the benefactor phase. In 1948, Secretary of State George Marshall announced what became known as the Marshall Plan. Over 4 years, the United States transferred $13.3 billion to Western Europe, roughly $173 billion in today's terms. These were not loans, they were grants. The conditions were simple but transformative. Cooperate economically, integrate markets, and maintain open trade within Europe. The result was historic. Germany, France, Italy, the Netherlands, Belgium all received massive injections of capital. Europe rebuilt faster than anyone expected, and crucially, it rebuilt inside an American-designed system. Washington was comfortable nurturing potential competitors because it believed two things. First, a prosperous Europe was the strongest barrier against Soviet influence. Second, higher global production would expand demand in ways that ultimately favored American companies, even if trade numbers looked unfavorable. Yet beneath the success, a quiet dependency formed. Europe's recovery relied on American capital, access to American consumers, and, most critically, American security. NATO's creation in 1949 locked this arrangement in place. The U.S. military shield allowed European states to reduce defense spending and redirect resources toward growth and exports. America provided security. Europe focused on economics. By 1958, the system appeared flawless. European currencies became convertible. Multilateral trade flourished. Industrial output surpassed pre-war levels. West Germany's economic miracle took off. France modernized rapidly. Italy industrialized. Everything worked. But only within the boundaries of American leadership. This was the original bargain. Europe exchanged strategic independence for economic growth. The United States accepted imbalance in exchange for long-term influence. For decades, both sides benefited. Then the cycle advanced. Stage 2, the partnership phase. From the late 1950s through the 1990s, the relationship matured. The European Economic Community formed and eventually evolved into the European Union. Europe built its own regulatory systems, its own institutions, its own vision of market governance. Transatlantic trade exploded. Political coordination became routine. Cultural ties deepened. It looked like equality. But the foundation never changed. Security still flowed from Washington. Market access still depended on the United States. And the system still rested on American tolerance for imbalance. That imbalance would not last forever. During this phase, friction never disappears, but it stays contained. Trade disputes flare up regularly. The long-running Boeing versus Airbus subsidy battle, arguments over farm protections and food standards, conflicts surrounding hormone-treated beef and genetically modified crops. Yet these clashes unfold inside agreed boundaries. Both sides take their cases to the World Trade Organization. Both sides largely respect rulings and procedures. The system still functions. Historians describe this era as one of embedded liberalism. Markets are open, trade flows freely, but governments retain enough flexibility to protect domestic priorities, social welfare, employment, and economic stability. The Cold War provides the glue holding everything together. As long as the Soviet Union remains a threat, the transatlantic partnership has a clear strategic purpose. Economic disagreements are tolerable because they are secondary to a larger mission, containing communist expansion. Trade tensions exist, but they never outweigh security concerns. Then in 1991, the Soviet Union collapses. The Cold War ends, and with it, the original justification for America's permanent security role in Europe. At first, the shift seems harmless. The 1990s are filled with optimism. Globalization accelerates. Liberal democracy appears triumphant. Some even declare the end of history. Europe pushes deeper integration and introduces the euro in 1999. Trade expands. Cooperation continues. On the surface, nothing looks broken, but underneath, the system is already changing. That transformation accelerates sharply in 2001, when China joins the World Trade Organization. This marks stage 3 of the cycle, the imbalance phase. China's entry into the WTO is supposed to bring it into the rules-based global economy. American policymakers argue that economic integration will produce political and market liberalization. As China grows richer, it will play by the same rules as everyone else. It will become a responsible participant in the global system. That is not what happens. Instead, globalization enters a new, extreme phase. Supply chains fragment across continents. Production migrates wherever labor is cheapest and regulation weakest. Industrial capacity drains out of the United States and Europe and flows overwhelmingly into China, but the imbalance is deeper than cost alone. China does not operate as the system assumes. State-owned firms receive massive subsidies. Intellectual property is routinely copied. Market access is restricted. Currency management favors exports. And the scale of China's industrial expansion is unlike anything seen before. Made in China 2025 becomes a roadmap for dominance. Steel, aluminum, solar panels, electric vehicles, advanced manufacturing, robotics, aerospace. For the United States, this triggers a domestic reckoning. Manufacturing regions hollow out. Factory employment collapses. Entire towns lose their economic base. The working class, promised opportunity through free trade, sees wages stagnate and communities unravel. The central promise of the Bretton Woods system, that rising trade would lift everyone, appears broken. And this is where Europe makes a decisive error. Rather than recalibrating, European governments, especially Germany, double down on export-driven growth. Industry 4.0 becomes the guiding strategy. The objective is clear: maximize exports, maintain trade surpluses, and prioritize external demand over domestic consumption. By the 2010s, Germany is running trade surpluses approaching 9% of GDP. Cars, machinery, chemicals, pharmaceuticals flood global markets. Increasingly, those goods flow to the United States, which continues absorbing deficits. By 2024, the European Union's trade surplus with America reaches roughly $200 billion. Put plainly, this is not marginal trade. German auto exports to the U.S. alone exceed $20 billion annually. Volkswagen, BMW, Mercedes-Benz, Porsche dominate the premium segment. German industrial machinery anchors American manufacturing and energy projects. Chemicals and pharmaceuticals integrate deeply into U.S. supply chains. And Germany is not alone. France ships more than $60 billion in goods to the American market. Luxury brands, aerospace components, wine, cosmetics. Italy sends roughly $40 billion. Fashion, machinery, furniture, food products. The Netherlands, though small, channels enormous trade volumes through Rotterdam, much of it tied directly to U.S. commerce. The pattern is unmistakable. America consistently buys more from Europe than Europe buys from America, year after year, decade after decade. This is not accidental. It reflects deliberate choices. Europe structures its economy around export competitiveness. Wage restraint keeps costs down. Energy prices are cushioned. Research and development is heavily supported by the state. The system is engineered to produce high-value goods for foreign markets. Meanwhile, the United States organizes its economy around consumption. Americans purchase imports, paying with dollars that cycle back as investments: treasury bonds, equities, real estate. This recycling allows the U.S. to sustain chronic trade deficits without currency collapse. But the cost is industrial decline, factories shut, jobs vanish, communities built on manufacturing lose their foundation. Europe's success, however, rests on a hidden dependency. While exporting heavily to the U.S., Europe continues to rely on American military protection. Defense spending remains low. Most NATO members fail to meet even the modest 2% of GDP target. Europe sells into American markets while sheltering beneath an American security umbrella, while simultaneously constructing regulatory systems that American firms view as restrictive and uneven. From the American perspective, especially from workers who lost livelihoods, this no longer looks like partnership. It looks like exploitation. What was once meant to be a temporary post-war arrangement has hardened into permanence. The Bretton Woods bargain has flipped, and by this stage it appears to benefit Europe at the expense of the United States. Resentment had been simmering for decades, building quietly through the 2000s and 2010s. Trade disputes flared intermittently: steel tariffs, Airbus subsidies, digital services taxes, but the system endured. Elite financial and tech sectors in the United States continued to profit from global markets. Stock prices rose, corporate earnings boomed, the costs of globalization fell unevenly. They were carried by workers in select regions, while benefits flowed to capital owners, professionals, and credentialed elites. Everything changed in 2016. Donald Trump won the presidency on a sharply anti-globalization platform. His message was blunt. America had been exploited. Foreign trading partners had taken advantage of open markets. Deals were lopsided. The entire framework needed restructuring. During his first term, Trump imposed tariffs on steel and aluminum, threatened to reduce U.S. commitment to NATO, demanded higher defense spending from European allies, and engaged China in a full-blown trade war. Then, after losing the 2020 election, Trump ceded the presidency to Joe Biden. For a brief moment, it seemed this pre-Trump status quo might return, but the underlying pressures had not disappeared. American workers remained frustrated over lost manufacturing jobs. China continued to accumulate massive trade surpluses and flout trade norms. European nations still relied on U.S. security while erecting regulatory barriers that disadvantaged American companies, which provided sweeping incentives to bring U.S. manufacturing back from overseas. Technology exports to China were restricted. The bipartisan consensus had shifted. Unconditional faith in globalization was over. Then, in 2024, Trump returned to the White House, but this time he did not improvise. He arrived with a team that had spent 4 years plotting a precise strategy for restructuring America's economic relationships. Legal authorities were mapped. Leverage points were identified. The plan was ready. This marks stage 4, the reversal phase. Trump's second inauguration on January 20th, 2025, signaled the start. Within weeks, his administration began executing Liberation Day tariffs. The logic was simple. Chronic trade deficits had hollowed out American manufacturing and left the country dependent on potential rivals. This was a matter of national security. Tariffs were the corrective measure. On April 2nd, 2025, an executive order was signed. Reciprocal tariffs were imposed on countries with large trade surpluses against the U.S. The European Union faced 30% duties on most goods, 100% on pharmaceuticals, and even higher rates on German automobiles. The economic consequences were potentially catastrophic for European exporters. Initially, European leaders tried to respond with bravado. Threats of retaliation surfaced. A counter-tariff package totaling $93 billion was drafted, targeting iconic American products: motorcycles, jeans, bourbon. Rhetoric invoked rules-based international order and European sovereignty. Public statements emphasized that Europe would not yield to American coercion. Behind closed doors, however, panic was spreading. Europe had no leverage. Germany's economy, heavily reliant on exports, could not survive a trade war with the United States. The automotive industry alone employed hundreds of thousands and depended on American consumers. A 30% tariff on German cars would be devastating. France could threaten verbally, but its luxury goods, aerospace firms, and pharmaceutical companies were deeply intertwined with U.S. markets. Italy's fashion industry, the Netherlands' high-tech exports, Sweden's industrial output, all faced ruin under the proposed tariffs. And there was another inescapable factor: security. Russia was actively waging war in Ukraine. Europe's ability to resist Russian aggression and support Ukraine depended on American military backing. Trade concessions were suddenly inseparable from defense reliance. Trump's team made this explicit. Private discussions made clear that continued American support for Ukraine was contingent on economic compliance. The message was unmistakable. Europe was no longer negotiating as a peer, it was pleading for continued protection. On July 27, 2025, Ursula von der Leyen flew to Scotland. Negotiations at Turnberry lasted only 3 hours. The result was an unequivocal American victory. The terms were striking. Tariffs on EU goods were capped at 15%, presented as a concession, but in reality, 10 times the pre-Trump average of 1.5%. Europe agreed to remove all tariffs on American industrial goods, granting the U.S. free access, while European exporters faced a 15% barrier entering America. The deal's energy component was equally consequential. The EU committed to purchasing $750 billion in American energy over 3 years, $250 billion per year in LNG, oil, and coal. European nations were restructuring their energy supply chains, increasing reliance on American fossil fuels, even as their own green transition policies took a back seat. Europe had traded economic autonomy for survival. Its negotiation power had been exposed as a myth, and in that moment at Turnberry, the balance of global trade and the rules of engagement for the next decade had shifted decisively in favor of the United States. The European Union didn't just agree to buy American energy, they committed to investing $600 billion in U.S. manufacturing over the next 3 years. European companies would build factories on American soil, create American jobs, and effectively relocate production to the United States. Defense followed economics. European nations, finally raising defense budgets after decades of underinvestment, pledged to purchase hundreds of billions of dollars in American military equipment. Rather than developing European defense industries, Europe would now rely even more heavily on American weapon systems. And the deal reached into the heart of European regulation. Landmark sustainability rules, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, the Deforestation Regulation, were all placed on the table for modification to accommodate American corporate interests. European rules designed to enforce human rights, environmental responsibility, and climate action were suddenly negotiable. American car safety standards were recognized. Agricultural approvals were streamlined, even for pork and dairy that didn't meet European regulations. Rules of origin were negotiated to reduce Chinese content in European exports, forcing Europe to decouple from China and weakening its policy independence. Perhaps the most humiliating aspect, the agreement was not legally binding. It was a political declaration, a framework, a joint statement. The U.S. could change or withdraw provisions at any time by executive order, while European failure to comply triggered automatic U.S. tariffs of 30% or more. European leaders tried to frame the outcome positively. Ursula von der Leyen described the deal as strong, if not perfect, emphasizing predictability and stability. But the reactions were stark. French Prime Minister François Bayrou called it a dark day for free peoples submitting to pressure. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz warned of severe financial consequences. Industry groups in Germany decried the deal as inadequate, with huge negative impact on the country owing its export economy. Markets reacted immediately. The euro fell 0.7% against the dollar. Volkswagen shares dropped 3%, Stellantis 2.5%. American energy companies surged 5% as investors anticipated massive European purchases of LNG, oil, and coal. Public opinion in Europe collapsed. Approval of the United States fell from 47% in October 2024 to 29% by April 2025, an 18-point drop in just 6 months. In Denmark, favorable views of America fell from 47% to 13%. Similar declines appeared across Germany, France, and the Netherlands. Politically, the deal deepened European divisions. Countries heavily dependent on U.S. trade or wary of Russian threats accepted it as pragmatism. France decried it as betrayal. The European Parliament threatened to block implementation, questioning legality and treaty compliance. Agricultural groups protested the loosening of food safety standards. Environmental organizations condemned the forced fossil fuel purchases. Labor unions worried about manufacturing jobs. Behind closed doors, debates raged. French parliamentarians argued the precedent would cripple Europe's negotiating credibility for decades. German industry representatives countered that economic collapse was the alternative. Mass layoffs, factory closures, potential recession. Eastern European voices raised the Ukraine question. If trade resistance meant U.S. military support might waver, was pride worth Ukrainian territory? Italy faced its own dilemma. Luxury exports totaling over $15 billion annually, Gucci, Prada, Ferrari, would be devastated by tariffs. Accepting American demands meant compromising national identity tied to quality and tradition. Spanish, Dutch, Irish, and Swedish officials faced similar stakes across wine, olive oil, high-tech equipment, pharmaceuticals, machinery, and telecommunications. Every country had a sector that could be destroyed by a threatened 30% tariff. The European Commission argued for collective acceptance. Better to negotiate as a bloc, even from weakness, than risk countries cutting bilateral deals with Washington. If Europe fractured, individual nations' desperation would destroy the EU's bargaining power entirely. The argument barely held. Cracks were visible. Hungary's Viktor Orban praised the deal as realistic recognition of American power. Slovakia quietly signaled willingness to accept even harsher terms for U.S. security assurances. Austria considered its neutrality, questioning whether detachment from both Washington and Moscow might be preferable to this kind of subordination. In the end, Europe had survived, but at what cost? Economically, politically, and strategically, the continent had been forced to bend. And the Turnberry deal was only the beginning of a new reality, one where European prosperity depended entirely on American consent. The deal moves forward because Europe simply has no other choice. By October, the EU Council approves the legislation to eliminate tariffs on American goods. The European Parliament, despite fierce opposition, ultimately acquiesces. A 30% tariff on German cars and other exports is unthinkable. Economic collapse outweighs pride. But the implications go far beyond Europe. The Turnberry Agreement doesn't just restructure transatlantic trade, it fundamentally redefines the balance of power. For 80 years, since Bretton Woods, since the Marshall Plan, since NATO, the United States and Europe presented themselves as partners, allies, equal players in a shared system. That fiction is now dead. The Turnberry Agreement reveals the truth. Europe is not a partner. Europe is a dependent. When economic interests collide with alliance obligations, Europe bends. Because European prosperity was built on foundations it never controlled. American markets, American security, American tolerance for trade imbalances. The U.S. Trade Representative frames this as a new system. He calls it the Turnberry system, designed to replace the untenable and unsustainable Bretton Woods order. What does this mean? Multilateral rules are secondary. Bilateral leverage reigns. America uses its market size and its security umbrella to extract concessions. Trade is no longer neutral. It is a tool of power. This is the final stage of a historical pattern. Stage 1. America builds the system, absorbing costs to create prosperity. Stage 2. The system operates with genuine partnership. Stage 3. Imbalances accumulate as others benefit more than America. Stage 4. America reasserts control, using structural power to rebalance the relationship on its terms. And Europe is just the beginning. The Turnberry model is being applied worldwide. Japan, for example, faces eerily similar pressure. Like Europe, it built its post-war prosperity within an American-designed economic and security framework. U.S. occupation reformed institutions. American markets absorbed exports. U.S. security allowed minimal defense spending. Japan now faces the same choice: align fully with U.S. demands or risk economic isolation. Japanese automakers, Toyota, Honda, Nissan, have invested billions in U.S. factories to hedge against this pressure, but the Trump administration wants more. Greater investment, more production in America, more purchases of American goods, higher defense spending, and closer alignment on China policy. South Korea confronts an even sharper dilemma. It needs U.S. protection against North Korea, but cannot maintain deep economic ties with China while doing so. The Turnberry model forces a stark choice. Pick a side. Canada and Mexico, despite NAFTA and USMCA, are learning the same lesson. Integration and proximity do not guarantee immunity. Canada must comply with U.S. demands or risk renegotiation of supply chains. Mexico, highly dependent on American markets and remittances, faces pressure across trade, energy, immigration, and border security. Compliance is no longer optional. It is survival. Australia, geographically distant, faces similar dynamics. Alignment with the U.S. on China policy has economic consequences. Hosting American military bases and increasing defense spending comes at the cost of trade with China, Australia's largest partner. The price of U.S. protection continues to rise. India retains more maneuvering space due to its market size, but even Delhi feels the pressure. America wants India aligned as a counterweight to China, reducing ties with Russia, opening preferential market access to U.S. companies, and supporting U.S. strategic objectives in Asia. Strategic autonomy is increasingly costly. Even China, powerful and self-sufficient, is not immune. Technology, finance, and trade restrictions are forcing Beijing to choose, comply with U.S. Altwaters-led constraints or risk systematic decoupling from the Western economic system. What we are witnessing is the end of the globalization era that began in the 1990s. It is not a return to Cold War blocs, nor a simple reshuffling of trade rules. It is a new reality, a world where economic relationships are explicitly structured around geopolitical power. Market access is conditional. Trade has become a tool of statecraft. Alignment is enforced not through treaties or norms, but through leverage. The Turnberry Agreement did not just restructure European trade, it reshaped the rules of global economic engagement. and the world is only beginning to understand the consequences. If you want, I can combine all of your Turnberry sections, from the initial negotiations to the global consequences, into one full cinematic YouTube script with stages, visuals cues, and dramatic pacing, so it reads like a complete exposé. For Europe, the implications are profound. The dream of strategic autonomy is exposed as a fantasy. Europe doesn't have autonomy, it has dependence, and this dependence is triple-layered. Trade dependence on American markets, energy dependence on American and allied suppliers after cutting ties with Russian gas, military dependence on American protection against Russian aggression. This triple dependence leaves Europe almost no room for independent foreign policy. When American interests conflict with European interests, Europe loses. When American companies compete with European companies, American firms gain preferential access. When American strategic priorities diverge from European priorities, Europe must follow or face economic and security consequences. Some analysts call for a radical rethink. Europe must reduce dependence on both the United States and China, build true strategic autonomy through higher defense spending, industrial policies favoring European companies, and trade diversification toward other partners. But the obstacles are enormous. Countries disagree on fundamental economic and foreign policy priorities. Germany wants export markets preserved at all costs. France wants political independence, but lacks the economic weight to achieve it alone. Eastern European nations prioritize American security guarantees above all else. Even the euro faces questions. If European monetary policy must account for American tariffs, and fiscal policy is constrained by subsidies for American energy and military equipment, can the European Central Bank maintain price stability? Can monetary union survive when external political shocks override internal economic control? The deeper question: can the European Union survive as a meaningful political entity if it cannot defend its economic interests against external pressure? If member states conclude that their welfare depends on bilateral deals with Washington rather than collective EU action, the logic of European integration collapses. Why maintain elaborate EU institutions if they cannot protect European interests when it matters most? This is the systemic revelation. What looked like a trade negotiation was actually a stress test of the European project, and Europe failed. Forced to choose between economic pain and political sovereignty, Europe chose to minimize pain by surrendering sovereignty. This sets a precedent. European red lines aren't really red lines. European values are negotiable. Strategic autonomy is a slogan, not reality. The pattern traced from Bretton Woods to Turnberry reveals a fundamental truth. Systems created by a dominant power for the benefit of many will eventually be restructured by that power when costs outweigh benefits. Generosity in Stage 1 gives way to partnership in Stage 2, which leads to imbalance in Stage 3, and finally Stage 4, forced correction. The United States built a system of open markets and security guarantees. It allowed Europe and other regions to prosper. But prosperity built on someone else's guarantee is conditional. And when the guarantor changes the rules, those who depended on the guarantee have two choices: build independent power or accept new terms. Europe chose to accept the terms. And that choice will define its economics and politics for a generation. This is what happened at Turnberry. This is why European approval of America collapsed. This is why Turnberry matters far beyond trade statistics and tariffs. It marks a fundamental shift in global power dynamics. The era of American-led globalization with Europe as partner is over. What begins now is American-enforced economic spheres, with Europe subordinate. The question is whether Europe will accept this permanently, or whether this humiliation will finally provoke the political will to build genuine independence. History suggests an answer. Systems based on domination provoke resistance, but resistance requires unity, investment, sacrifice, and time. Europe has shown little of any of these in recent decades, which means the pattern may have one more stage: permanent dependence. What began as partnership and ended in submission could become normalized. This is the real story of how America outplayed the European Union, not through a single negotiation at Turnberry, but through 80 years of structural positioning. Europe had prosperity, but no power. And when tested, prosperity without power meant submission. Every single time. If you want, I can now combine all of your Turnberry sections, from the initial negotiations through the deal terms to the European consequences, into one full cinematic YouTube script with visual cues, dramatic pacing, and voiceover-ready phrasing, so it reads like a complete exposé.